Welcome to The Growth Project, a podcast brought to you by Synergy Performance. Our mission with this podcast is to explore the topics of growth, performance, and personal development through conversations with individuals pursuing success and by using current events in business and sports to discuss strategies on how you can grow into the individual that you want to be.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Growth Project. My name is Cory Shaffer. Before I get into introducing this week's guest, I want to give you guys a reminder that The Growth Project is now available on Apple iTunes, Google Play, as well as Spotify. And you can also always listen to our podcast through our website on synergyperformancesc.com. Whatever you choose to do as far as listening to the podcast, we'd really appreciate it if you get on and review it for us. Leave us some feedback. We'd love to hear from you. All right, this week's guest is Michael Roth. If you're a local to the South Carolina or Greenville area, you probably know the name Michael Roth. It's kind of a local legend in terms of baseball in South Carolina. So Michael played baseball at the University of South Carolina, where he won back-to-back College World Series in 2011, 2012. He was drafted by the Los Angeles Angels in 2012 and then played 7 professional seasons. He recently stepped away from baseball, and I've gotten to know Michael over the last year or so. So what you'll hear in the first part of our conversation, this is the first ever 2-part podcast here on the Growth Project. What you'll hear in part 1 is just a little bit about his background and really sort of a frameworks for how he kind of developed over the course of his career. So we hope you enjoy this. This is part 1. Here's Michael Roth. All right, Michael, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to go back to the beginning and really just get into how you started playing baseball, why you started playing baseball, even just when. So let's go back to the beginning there. Tell me about your baseball beginnings.
The beginning of baseball. Well, I started playing my first year of playing baseball. I was 3 at the YMCA. I think my mom actually lied on my form so I could play because I had an older brother who's 11 years older than me and an older sister who's 8 years older than me. So I was always the youngest and I was running around. And I think I was driving her crazy. So they signed me up to play baseball as early as possible, and I played t-ball at the YMCA. That was my first taste. As you can imagine, I don't remember any of that. That's.
But 3 years old is young. Most kids are like 5 or 6.
Yeah, that is young. It is young. So I got started early. My whole family was into sports. My dad played sports in college. My mom was athletic. She was on the synchronized. She did synchronized swimming, and my brother was super athletic, probably the most athletic in our family. Really? And then my sister played basketball all the way up into high school. But yeah, I mean, we were just always, sports was kind of like ingrained in our family, but baseball was always something that I really enjoyed. I played soccer and basketball growing up. Dabbled in football once, and they wanted me to be the quarterback. I told them I couldn't throw it because I couldn't throw a football, like throwing a baseball.
Looking back, huh?
And throwing a football is entirely different. And the guy was like, "Oh, but we'll teach you how to throw a football." And I really wanted to be the guy not getting hit and doing the hitting. So I quickly was like, I don't think football's for me.
Got it.
But, yeah, and just started playing. I mean, I played all those sports growing up, but baseball was always – I was kind of the kid that, the sport that I was playing that season was – my favorite,
yeah.
And then as the end, you're like, man, I'm excited for basketball season, and then basketball is coming. You're like, oh, I'm excited for baseball. So, baseball really didn't become a passion for me, or really like a love, until I was probably 12 or 13.
Okay.
And that's really when I started to like be more serious about it. When I was 12, 13, 14, I started to get into middle school and high school. I started, the extra time that I had from school or whatever was devoted towards taking pitching lessons or hitting in the backyard. Some of my earliest memories growing up are my dad coming home from work, and he was always one of those guys that worked like pretty late. And he would come home from work, and we didn't have a huge backyard, but we had it big enough where we could hit these wiffle balls, and we had the floodlights, but they were the floodlights that would come on like they were motion activated, and so it would be, like you could barely see out there, and I'm like jumping up trying to wave the bat to get the light to come on, and my dad would like fire off like 10 wiffle ball pitches, and then I have to jump up again and wave the bat. But that's that was probably, that was my transition from, playing baseball for fun. I always thought it was fun. It was fun when I was younger, but I really started to enjoy the work as I started to age.
Gotcha. Well, was it at that point then that you got out of basketball, soccer, and you really started to focus on baseball then?
Let me think. It was, I played soccer all the way up until either 7th or 8th grade. I played basketball all the way until my junior year in high school. So, baseball and soccer started to have the same seasons. So I tossed soccer aside. Still a big soccer fan though, I like watching it. But then as I played basketball when I was in high school, and I always viewed that as a good break. Like it was a good mental break. A good physical break to use other muscles.
That was going to be my next question, was how do you think playing a second sport contributed to baseball?
I mean, first off, I don't think I would have played as long as I did had I only focused on one sport. I mean, the amount of, even as an adult playing professionally for 7 years, it gets repetitive, and there's feelings of burnout that you have to push through, and it's a job, and it's something that I always wanted to do, but there's still those feelings. And I'm almost positive I would have experienced that as a child had I not had that rotation. And I think, when you play multiple sports, you start to learn how to be an athlete. You learn how to compete. I mean, there's differences in competing on the baseball field versus in basketball. Basketball is more physical, more contact. There's different muscles involved, like having to have a better aerobic, a better aerobic capacity when you're playing basketball versus baseball. And just the mental break that it provides is something that I think is underrated, something that people don't really realize, that it lets you just get away and forget about something, especially if you're a kid and like you have a tougher season or you struggle that year, which if you're progressively making jumps and playing against older kids or pushing yourselves, there's going to be some years that are harder. And that was the case for me. That's it wasn't always like growth was not always like this straight line, and as much as you wanted it to be, but you would it would give me a break to say, okay, now I can go to like basketball and like relax, and this is my fun sport, or whatever that is.
Kind of a clean slate in a year to just have a break, to do something different. Gotcha. No, and I mean, I think what you said is spot on. I hate these days how much you're seeing kids specialize in sports at like 12 years old, and I feel the same way. Like, A, they get into college and they're not athletic, right? Yeah. And B, they don't develop the same competitiveness or team skills or whatever it might be, and they're more susceptible to burnout. So it's probably a separate podcast for a different day. But you did start to get on a track that I want to go down, and that was just, I think a lot of people assume that you played professional baseball, like you said, for 7 years, that things, especially early on, were probably just this perfect linear line of growth.
Right.
But I think you started to allude to, at least, like, it wasn't always the case. Like, you definitely had challenges and you had to face some obstacles. So what were those, especially in that like middle school, high school age range?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you look back for every athlete, you'll probably see that the growth was not just a steady. It wasn't just some straight line of, I was bad and I became really good, without these hills and valleys. And And that's because, like, I mean, life is not that way. It's very much of, you reach a certain point and then maybe you start to plateau a little bit, and then you have to figure out what the next stepping stone is. For me, when I was 9 and under, that was like the first travel ball experience. And I was playing first base, and that's when kids are pitching, and I wasn't really into pitching at that time, but I made a significant jump from when I was 12 to 13. That was probably my biggest jump from when I was like pitching and hitting a good bit, and that's when I really started to pitch a lot better, and became more of like the guy on the team, that you are when you're 13. And you had middle school baseball at the time, and so I think you couldn't play as a sixth grader, but you could play in 7th and 8th grade, and I played in my 7th grade year. I made the team, and the coach at the time was some guy that I didn't particularly enjoy, but some of the things that I had to go through was challenging, because he would make you do things that I hadn't been exposed to yet.
Yeah.
And whether they were good for baseball or not, it was still something that it was a challenge. Mm-hmm. It was putting me up against failure. Mm-hmm. And something that you have to deal with failure in order to get better. And I remember this game in that was my 7th grade year. I think I started a game against Riverside Middle School, and we were playing at the old Greenville Braves Stadium, which they've since like demolished and redone or something. But and I pitched, and I think I got rocked. Like, I'm pretty sure I was out within like the 2nd or 3rd inning, mm-hmm. maybe earlier. And I remember like coming in the dugout like feeling bad about myself because it was a playoff game, and I was like, thought I was a good pitcher, and at that point I was playing with kids older than me, and I just realized, I remember that feeling, and I remember kind of like pouting about it in the dugout. Mm-hmm. And one of my buddies, who's still one of my good friends today, like came up to me and was like, "Hey man, like quit acting like an idiot, basically, and like get it together." And I was like, "Man, you're right. Like, I need to figure this out." And I went on, had a good 8th grade year, and then 9th grade year, that was really tough, like a really hard transition. Mm-hmm. You're a 9th grader, you're trying to break into whether it's the JV team or the varsity, and I was lucky enough I made varsity. So I was playing varsity as a freshman, and again, you're exposed to a coach where it was, he's dealing with older players. There were guys that were 3-4 years older than me. Right. And you're facing guys that are going to play in college, the next year. And so it's hard, but it made me a better player. I think I ended up hitting like 290 something my freshman year, which isn't that bad in the scheme of things, but you go from being your best player on your middle school team or your travel ball team, mm-hmm. and in 8th grade, 7th and 8th grade, and then you go to being just an okay player on your high school team, right, and you have to make that jump. And so that for me was tough, because that was really the first time that I was no longer the best on the team. Yeah. And you go, and this is all true for probably a lot of professional baseball players. They go from being a lot of those guys that I played with, they were the best on their high school team, mm-hmm. the best on their college team, or the best on their 9U team, whatever it was. And so each of us, had to make jumps at each level, because when I was a freshman, I definitely wasn't the best on the team. Right. And so it was hard. Like, I remember going home that year and being like, why do I suck? Like, why can't I hit that guy? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't always fun. There were some games after I would go home and I was like, man, I can't, like, I'm not good, and I'm like, well, and ever since I can remember, I always wanted to play baseball professionally. Yeah. Like, that was always something I wanted to do. So when I would face moments of adversity like that, I'd be like, man, am I really going to be able to play baseball professionally if I suck as a freshman?
Right.
You know?
Well, no, it's funny though, right? Because those are the moments, right? So when adversity hits or when you fail, that you really start questioning. You ask the question like, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Right? And unless you have a really solid answer, I mean, that's when a lot of people at some point fail over and over again, unless you have that really solid why, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's when people give up on it.
Yeah.
But as a guy who played from 3 years old, definitely had the dream of playing Major League Baseball. So what did you then rely on to get you through those moments? And I'm assuming this is something you kind of mentioned. It happened again in South Carolina. It probably happened again in the first transition up to pro ball, right? And so... And you mentioned too, like, that's life, right? It's full of those transitions. So what have you relied on in those moments to get you through?
That's a good question.
Weren't ready for that one.
I think it's a mixture of things. You know, part of it, as I was growing up, I always had this competitive spirit and this desire to be the best. I mean, part of why I always enjoyed working at like my craft at baseball or even it was the other sports too. I never had a problem putting in the work. I enjoyed that because I wanted to be the best. I don't necessarily, maybe that was, and that partly is probably like a narcissistic thing, like being prideful, and but also I think it's how I was raised a little bit. Like if I was going to do something, make sure I do it right.
Yep.
What got me through my freshman year, like there were definitely like hard moments where I thought, man, if I can't play here now as my freshman year in high school, like how am I going to get, even better? And I think it was at that moment that I really like was brought back to just the reality of where I was. Like one, I was like a 14-year-old, or I think 14 or 15, however old I was. And if I didn't go play baseball the next year, was it really the end of my life? No. I think it was almost like fear setting, right? And I don't know if that's the right term, but like just thinking of like the worst case scenario. If I never played baseball again, or if I had never made it above that level, what in the scheme of things would it really matter?
Right.
And
would you still be okay?
Yeah. Would I still be okay?
Yeah. Some of that though, I mean, as a 15-year-old, let's say, that's a pretty heavy perspective. I mean, like really good perspective.
Yeah.
Right. So is that just something you feel like you learned maybe just from your parents, from older siblings?
I think it was like part of my parents helping, like coaching me along, but also realizing numerous times that like my parents never pressured me to play. Yeah. It was always like, are you having fun doing it? Then do you want to play?
Right.
And so part of that fear setting too is like, well, if I'm not having fun, why am I doing it? And you always have fun when you're winning or when you're doing well, but there's parts of life and there's parts of baseball that you have to do in order to be successful or to still be able to play in order to have the fun,
Right.
And so I think part of it also brought me back, like part of that, like, okay, is this the worst case scenario? It made me realize that it was still like baseball was a game, that it was something that I was supposed to enjoy.
Yeah.
And even if I went 0 for 4, or if I was pitching, and I didn't pitch well, there still had to be some sort of component that was enjoyable at that time. Like, why did I show up to the field that day? It wasn't just to throw my 7 innings and like beat my chest and say I'm the best. It was really to hang out with, my buddies and hang out with all my friends for that day.
Right.
And that was very similar in college. You kind of go on these, you ride these waves as much as you don't want to, but I did that. The same thing I did in my freshman year in high school, I did in my freshman year in college too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so what I heard there though was just again some good perspective, right? Keeping baseball in its place, like it's what I do, it's not who I am, kind of thing. There's some humility in there as well of being able to say like, I'm not God's gift to baseball maybe right now as a freshman in high school, right? I've got some work to do. And then at the same time, you mentioned just the competitive spirit and stuff to like, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's keep going. Transitioning into college, I think more so, and then even getting into professionally, what was your mindset on the mound? So whether maybe some conscious things that you did or unconscious things that you did, like what did you do to prepare yourself to pitch? That's what I want to know as the mental game guy.
Yeah. Well, let me first start by talking about going to college.
Okay.
Because I think that was instrumental in my mindset as a pitcher.
I'm good with that, yeah.
When I was getting recruited, I always wanted to be a hitter, and I thought I was going to be a hitter. When I was going to South Carolina, I thought I was going to play first base, and but yeah, I thought I would be a two-way guy, and pitching would be on the very back end. And then in my freshman year, I ended up really struggling. They changed some things in my swings. I didn't adapt well enough. And I went through that period again. And like, man, is this something I'm actually going to be able to do? Like, do I need to think about actually having a major that I need to use, or should I transfer? I mean, I started asking all these questions. Am I good enough?
Right.
And, there were multiple times where I failed as a freshman. But the one thing that I did do was I was always pitching well, and I think part of that was I always wanted to hit. I think I put a lot of pressure on myself when I was going up to the plate to get a hit, to make something happen.
Right.
And when I pitched, as bad as it sounds, I didn't care.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, well, this doesn't matter because I don't really want to do this, And so as a freshman, I was pitching out of just kind of pure necessity. We didn't have a great team that year and didn't have a deep bullpen, so I just got opportunities and I did decent. And I think that almost like nonchalant attitude helped me on the mound.
Yeah, nonchalant. It's not like you didn't care in terms of like you wanted to do well, but there weren't expectations maybe.
Yeah, I think the expectations were like, hey, you're mopping up innings, or like, hey,
you're just.
I didn't build any expectations for myself on the mound, and I also. Yeah, it wasn't that I didn't care. Like, I wanted to perform, but I think I cared more about hitting because that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
The pitching was more like, well, I'm just doing this because I'm quasi-successful at it right now.
I had one of the pro ball guys that I worked with when he was in college. He put it really well for me a couple of years ago. He said, like, pitching is the perfect balance between, like, I care so intensely about what happens on every pitch, and I could care less about every pitch.
Yeah.
Right? It's the perfect midpoint there. And if you just, if you're on one side of that or the other, you're probably struggling a little bit.
Oh, certainly. And I think that might be like athletics as a whole.
Probably,
honestly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it could be, it probably rolls over into a lot of things. It definitely does. And we can get to that later because I'm thinking of stuff right now. But so when I go back for my sophomore year, I was like, my mindset from answering some of those questions, should I transfer? My thought was, well, if I'm not good enough to cut it here, my ultimate goal was to play in the big leagues. If I'm not good enough to cut it here, then I'm not going to cut it in the big leagues, which can be flawed thinking or not. There's plenty of guys that transferred out and then ended up having really solid careers. But that was my way of thinking. And so I think that was like, one, just like, hey, toughen up and deal with it. Like grow, like find a way to grow yourself and change the player that you are. And then so I go into my sophomore year and I became like the lefty specialist guy and still wanting to hit, still disappointed with like kind of the playing time, the role that I was playing. I was coming in facing like a lefty at literally coming in facing like one guy, two guys.
Big situation.
Out.
Yeah.
And again, the attitude that I took was it was more like, well, I'm just gonna come in there and get my guy out. Like, I'm left-handed, he's left-handed, he doesn't have a chance, but like, whatever, you know.
Yeah.
That was kind of like, again, the relaxed, but
confident though.
Yeah, I was confident.
Yeah.
Like I knew that because of what I was doing. Like I got to the point where I was like, okay, well, I'm only facing a lefty. Like I'm gonna get this guy out basically 90% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a pretty good percentage of me doing my job,
right?
You know?
Right.
And
so did that free you up to just pitch?
Yeah, and I think that's what I was able to do. Like I was just like, oh yeah, whatever, you know, and just went out there and did my thing and got in a good groove, but I still was not like thrilled. And some of that I think was due to just like, again, I was used to being like the best on the team, you know, and then you go from not being the best and then you are, well, what am I? Like, what am I? Where do I rank? Like how?
Right.
What's my identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think athletes deal with that a lot. Like, do they identify with themselves as their sport? And you mentioned it already. Like it's not who I am. It's just something I do.
Right.
But I think it's like a fine line because I've played baseball for so long that, and I've pursued that goal of like accomplishing my goal of playing baseball at the next level, which was in college and then professionally and then Major League Baseball, that then it's, you know, it becomes a part of you. You're doing all this stuff on the weekend, you're putting all this work, and it's all baseball. So it's this fine line of realizing your identity is not wrapped up into the game, but at the same time, it is
part of it.
You know, it feels like such a part of
you.
Well,
when the trickle-down effect is, it's a part of who you are because it impacts what you do.
Right.
That's the clearest expression of, you know, this is definitely a part of me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But being able to separate that.
Right.
So I can go to the field and I can put my work in, or it's the off season and I can put my work in, but then go home and be present and, you know, have this whole other life almost.
Right. And I think that was the beneficial thing for me in college was when my freshman year happened, I was like, man, I need to figure out like what would I want to do if I have to like actually, you know, for a job. I started thinking about like the other side of, you know, my life.
Mm-hmm.
And my sophomore year, I was like definitely more social, you know, like my freshman year, I kind of like hung out in the dorm, didn't do much. My sophomore year, I started like just being more social, being more involved.
Mm-hmm.
So then I started to have like these almost two separate lives that I hadn't really lived before. You know, when you're in college, you have like this life of your sports life, like you're always doing something for baseball. But then I also had studying, and I was doing like trying to get in international business school and like getting involved in other organizations. So I think that did free me up because I started to have like there was another Michael other than just the Michael that played baseball.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. So then how going into junior year, right?
Yeah.
So then we go to the question. Michaels.
Yeah. So then we go to the question about how did I prepare as a pitcher?
Yeah.
And I think the biggest thing that as a reliever, I prepared like an everyday player, because when I was a reliever, I had to be ready to throw every day, and I felt like I did throw every day. So it was like a component of just showing up to the field, being ready to play. And I almost knew like I was loose before every game. I would warm up and throw with my throwing partner before every game. And so at that point I knew I just had to like reactivate my arm within like, you know, 10, 15 pitches, and I could just go throw and be ready to go.
Gotcha.
As a starter, that transitioned a lot.
And that starter piece didn't happen until
I made
junior year.
I made a couple starts I think I made one start my freshman, maybe two starts my freshman year, and then my first real start was against Clemson my sophomore year in the College World Series, and I had been a reliever that whole year, and I stayed the whole. I kept that the same. When they asked me if I wanted to start, I was like, yeah, I'll start. I was like, but on one condition. I was like, I still get to hit BP before the game, and I get to throw with my throwing partner, And they're like, yeah, do whatever you want. So, because I was pretty, at that time, I was like very, what's that word?
Superstitious?
Yeah, I was very superstitious. Yeah. And then when I became a starter, like a full-time starter my junior year, they're like, hey, you need to have this routine. And I had always kind of had a routine as a reliever. But, you build this routine and you're following this like 7-day thing because you're throwing once on a Friday or whatever it is. And so I did start to have a good like physical routine. And one of the things that I always remember doing was in my first start for the year, because they had told me like the week before that I was going to be the Friday guy. Mm-hmm. And whenever I pitched, I always had these nerves, like good nervousness, like these butterflies, and it was part like afraid to fail, but part of like just excited to go out there and pitch. Yeah. And I think those are good. You just have to use them the right way. Mm-hmm. And I remember we went out to dinner the night before, and this is probably not, some nutritionist is probably going to tell me we didn't eat the right things, and I won't disagree with her. But we had some massive steak dinner at like Roost Chris or something. Yeah. As college kids, we like treated ourselves for like the opening of the season. But I remember laying in bed that night, and I remember thinking like, man, what like visualizing if I pitched well the next day, and what would I say to the media afterwards? Because we had media around, so like what would I say to the media afterwards? If I pitched bad, what would I say to the media then? Mm-hmm. And I think that visualization, I'd always heard people like say it was good, so I kind of tried it. Mm-hmm. But it was more inadvertently just me laying in bed, sitting up and thinking like, okay, what am I doing the next day? Right. And kind of just running through scenarios. And I ended up pitching well, and just kind of all of that took off. And every time before every game, I would kind of do that same thing. The night before, I would think about, what would it look like if I pitched well? How would I react? How would I react on the mound? What would I say to the media after the game? If I pitched poorly, what would I do? And so that was one piece the night before. And then I was, again, superstitious, so I had like this routine that I followed like pretty religiously. And I think following that physical routine, like leading up to the game, I did like, I think it started like an hour and 30 minutes before, like doing some of those things physically that led me up to being able to pitch and throw my first pitch in the game. Actually, like, I think it mentally prepared me as well. Mm-hmm. As my body was physically preparing, each notch was getting harder and harder. Mentally, I was preparing as I went along through that process as well.
Well, do you mean sort of in terms of just like, I know I'm checking this box, and so like almost as if I know I just got myself a little bit more ready, right? There's a little bit more confidence now because I know I've done that part of the routine. Yeah. That kind of thing?
I think it was that, and also the focus piece too. Yep. Mentally saying, okay, check, yeah, I'm stretched, like my confidence level of me being warm and loose is there. But also, like the focus was, okay, I've stretched, now it's like bring the focus up to a higher piece. Gotcha. Like if on a 1 to 10, right, now a 1 being I'm screwing around, now it's up to a 3, and then I start to throw, I'm up to a 4.
Gotcha.
Finish throwing, I'm up to a 5.
Yeah. Okay, that's going to conclude part 1 of my conversation with Michael Roth. Please go ahead and tune in next week for part 2. We're going to continue the conversation right where we left off in part 1 and get a little bit more into mastery. That's the July theme here on the Growth Project. So we'll talk about mastery in terms of baseball and even life after baseball. So we look forward to having you tune in next week. Thanks.
If you're interested in learning more about what we do, visit our website at synergyperformancesc.com. Join us next time for more relevant topics on The Growth Project.